Hey, everybody, welcome back. As you all know, I am Jennifer Bulbrook with I Am Somebody, and my co host, Isabel Bradburn Jackson with Dear Divine Goddess. And we're putting together this docu-series called Lost Souls Initiative, where we're taking people's stories and sharing them with the world in hopes that we can make a change. And today we have a very special guest today. We have Miss Rebecca Rafesse. Rafesse, I just fucked that up. Rebecca, introduce yourself, please.
Hi, it's Rafuse, but and it's so funny because it's one of those names that people just can't get, and it's because of the way the letters are placed, because there's an E on the end. And anyways, so I'm
Yeah.
Rebecca. Rebecca, just Rebecca is good. And I am a registered psychotherapist, and I work out of my home, but out of Ontario. And so my online handle is Limestone Psychotherapy, where you can, contact me and find me if you want to. So how do I introduce myself? I always hate this part. My simplest way to say it, or where I share it on my platforms, is that I take psychology and metaphysical practices and I normalize the use of those things together to help people process their or navigate their neurodiversity and trauma. So that's the quickest way to explain what I do. I am an advocate for people with living with trauma or neurodiversities, because trauma, we're now bringing trauma into neurodiversity as a category. But mainly work with people who have identified having ADHD, autism, and PTSD or CPTSD. So a lot of my clientele are people who present with borderline personality disorder traits, and who identify as having ADHD symptoms and trauma symptoms. So that's what I do.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That is awesome because we need a lot of people in those, areas, working in those areas. So anytime I meet anybody, I'm like, that's just awesome.
Well, and you know what brought me to this was my personal experiences. So I know you guys talk a lot on your podcasts about people's stories, and mine is just the same as a lot of theirs. And it went down a path, and then it went down another path, and I was actively part of bringing it to where it is now. But I experienced a lot of childhood adversities. I experienced alcoholism in my family bloodline. I've had my own challenges with alcohol throughout my years because of just the predisposition of having that genetic kind of bloodline, basically. I don't know how much you guys have talked about, the roots of addiction, but so a lot of my work is really talks about how addiction is kind of a symptom, actually, of all of these things, right?
I believe that. I say it all the time. The
Yeah.
addiction is not the problem, it's the symptom.
Yeah. So I come from a lens, much like Gabor Mate, holistic psychology. Both of those are kind of well-known kind of handles or trailblazers in the mental health community that talk a lot about how a lot of the things that are happening in our lives, such as disorders, are actually symptoms of something that isn't right or isn't aligned with who we are and their coping mechanisms. So I do work from that lens. So when someone presents to me with an addiction, I don't actually focus on addiction work necessarily. I focus on the root. What is going on under the surface that's kind of bringing that trait to the surface, bringing that coping mechanism to the surface. And usually it's all rooted in shame, guilt, just not having a deep-rooted sense of not being understood or heard or seen from the moment you were born, pretty much. So, which is what a neurodiversity does to most individuals who live with it. So that's kind of, so my whole life was that. I was born with a neurodiversity. I'll be honest with you, I have some theories, and I know there are some therapeutic research, going on about this, that I do believe that some of my neurodiversity is because one of my parents was an alcoholic or active user of alcohol when I was conceived, and that interrupted the genetics. It did something to the seed, because it's hereditary, and Gabor Mate talks a lot about generational trauma, and how even our genetic makeup, our DNA makeup, is passed through our children. So even if I, had a relative, like say one of my parents beat the addiction, and I grew up, in a relatively normal household with no adversities, I could still be susceptible to an addiction if I have the wrong protective factors, or a bunch of the risk factors in play, or I have my own adverse experiences growing up. Then that puts me, I'm predisposed, is the word that we use in the therapeutic world. So I kind of explain it to people like we all have a dormant switch inside of us that is part of our entire bloodline back to, our furthest ancestor we can, calculate.
Exactly.
And it's all about our environment. It's about the people we're around. It's about the experiences that we have that switch on. And that's when we see the presenting, challenges in life, like anxiety, depression, and just ill coping strategies, right? Or unhealthy coping strategies. So that was my life, right? I spent my life living with the neurodiversity myself, and always feeling like I was the problem, that there was something wrong with me, because that was the messaging that I was always getting at school, at home, amongst my peers, because anyone who has neurodiversity knows that interrelational relationships are just challenging.
Interpersonal relationships, they're very challenging.
So when you factor in all that stuff, and then there were some traumatic events that did happen on top of that, so then that led to my passion around figuring out how to kind of be a part of the trailblazing and helping our society switch from what we call the medical model to the social model. So just to kind of give a quick explanation of what I mean by that, is that right now we function in a medical model, which means that you're presenting with a problem, so you're the problem. So we're going to give you medicine, we're going to put you into these programs, we might even just ostracize you altogether, and just leave you to fall through the cracks, instead of actually realizing that we're now needing to operate from a social model, which is that society is the problem, not the individual. And so this is the forefront of the research right now. In the last, I'd say maybe like 5 years, 10 years, we're seeing a lot of these trailblazers like Gabor Mate, a lot of the people who are doing the research is around the ACEs studies, the adverse childhood experience studies, are now starting to realize, that some of these things, some of these symptomologies are actually because of the environment that I grew up in, because of the trauma that I was exposed to, because of a broken school system, because of a broken government system, because of a broken justice system, whatever you want to call it. So I don't want to make it sound like I'm on my soapbox blaming the world for my problems, but the reality is that my journey, as before being a therapist, and excuse me, now as a therapist, has demonstrated evidence to me that the social model is the right one, and that's why we're failing so many people who are struggling severely, because we can't quite wrap our heads around how to incorporate them into our society and have them be included, and to not be so stuck on these regimented ways of having to do things like structured school classrooms and structured work environments. Like sometimes we've got to we've got to be a little flexible. And
Yeah.
so that's kind of the forefront of the work I'm doing now. I do a lot of speaking engagements in workplaces to help leaders understand how to support people that have neurodiversity. Because what we've seen just even during the pandemic is that we had like a 60% hike in diagnoses of ADHD and trauma. And so here's what's happening now is we're all back to norm, and people are back into these same workplaces that weren't functioning for them. And now we're seeing an increase in suicide. We're seeing an increase in depression. We're seeing an increase in anxiety. Drinking went off the scale for almost, a huge population during the pandemic, right? It was a coping strategy. So, while it's awful to have to go through some of these kind of big uncomfortable moments in our society, but it gives us evidence that shows us where we're broken and where we need to kind of move and fix things. And so you guys have been, largely focused on helping with the brokenness of treating addiction, which is beautiful because we know that is a big problem. I mean, we have, Gabor Mate is like, he's been writing books for 30 years on this, and he's now getting that recognition, right? So if you guys haven't, ever looked up Gabor, or you don't know anything about
his book, I love him. I
highly recommend.
I've read all of his books. I have them all on audiobooks. Like his book on addiction really helped me to understand my brother's addiction, and it helped me to change my perspective of it, because for the longest time I was like, I resented him for the pain he was putting all of us through. Do you know what I mean? Like how his addiction was affecting all of us.
Yeah.
But I never once took the time to think about the pain that he was in, that he was using to numb from. So it really changed my whole perspective, and it got me and my brother to a place where we were really close again before he passed, which is beautiful for me, because then I have all of those, as much as they still hurt to think about them right now, they're beautiful, and I have them for the rest of my life because we were talking every single day. And there's times where my brother and I had gone 3 years without even speaking.
Yeah.
Because of his addiction and
how
he was harmed.
Here's the beauty of therapy. And this is why I say that there's some brokenness there, because, people who are in addiction, they do need that reunification therapy. They need that type of therapy that helps address the family unit.
Absolutely.
So here's where I might rub people the wrong way as a therapist, because when I have a child that presents to me with behavioral struggles, addiction issues, whatever the trauma presentation is, and the parents are coming to me to say, fix my kid, there's something wrong with them. Well, I'm not focused on the kid. I'm focused back on you. I need to understand what's been going on in this kid's life. To get them here. And you know what? The parents may or may not be part of that, but I have to investigate that. And a lot of people don't like that because they don't want to take accountability for the fact that it's a family unit, right? And so then there is grief, there is sadness, there is anger, and these are all
frustration and resentment, all of it.
Right. But we don't, as humans in our society, the way it's constructed, we don't allow those emotions. No, go to your room. No, you don't get to say that. You don't get to do that. So what are you doing? Well, you're basically forcing that child to then go to their room and sit in isolation and find something to stimulate them or to soothe them. Well, guess what they're going to do the second they get their hands on something that is like huge, like dopamine receptor, right? Like it's
Yeah.
a, you give them something that just automatically makes them
Huge hit to
feel
dopamine,
euphoric.
yeah.
Well, they're up Schitt's Creek, pardon my French,
No, it's true.
and it wasn't their fault to begin with because nobody taught them coping mechanisms. They were just shamed for having a feeling and sent off to their room to sit alone.
Yeah, and I don't understand where that came from, that whole like just stuff it down, like just suck it up.
Well, I mean, I'm a Gen Xer, right? So this is how it was, right? I can remember, like never really talking about any of these things. One of my earliest traumas when I was, 10 years old, I can remember like this was a very, like when I look at it now as a therapist, this was like a huge trauma for the whole family. We lost somebody very significant in our lives, very tragically. Yeah. And it rocked all the adults. So we as the children were watching these adults like falling apart.
And
I can remember hearing my dad through the wall crying at night because he wouldn't show his emotion outside of that bedroom. So all day it's all smiles and fake and we're getting through to at night I'm in my room crying and I can hear him on the other side of the wall crying and nobody says anything. Nobody talks about it. So as a child, you don't understand those concepts. You just trust the adults and you go along with it. So was that a fault of my parents? Absolutely not. They were not taught. Their parents were alcoholic. My parents had it way worse than I did. And my parents did some work to make my life better, even though it wasn't the way that me as an adult would have raised my children.
They did the best with what they had. That's what I always say about my parents. But
again, that's why I go to the social model. It's a societal issue. It's not a medical issue. Like, yes, there is part of that plays a role. And I mean, we can get into that on a whole other podcast, but there are actual things happening from a physiological perspective that do contribute to addiction. But I mean, at the core, it has a lot to do with support and your support network and your connections and being able to make those in a securely attached way. And so, when we don't have secure attachment, this is when we go outside of ourselves to find something that feels good. And if you're somebody who has no family or is isolated from family, or, you just don't have any friends, or maybe you're just, maybe you're somebody who's extremely ADHD and it's your dopamine receptors that are actually putting you in this impulsiveness of doing the drugs. Yeah. Well, it's just like a cycle of shame. It's a cycle of I can't get out of it, and a cycle of ruining that family dynamic, right?
Because the guilt and the shame is what killed my brother. And I will say that like until my dying breath, because I know that it was the guilt and the shame that made him take his life. And funny enough, everyone that I have coached, or even people that I have talked to just about their own issues with mental health and addiction, it always, I haven't had one where it hasn't, but it always stems back to that secure attachment as a child.
Yep. It does. And so, if you listeners have not, looked into your attachment styles, there's lots of free resources. I can even send you guys some to put in the link of your
anxious attachment style.
Yeah. So there's different attachment styles. And so it's good to understand what yours is. And I want to say this as a preset to talking about this. There's nothing wrong with you if you don't have a secure attachment.
No, it's just understanding.
Just means that you have to understand what your attachment style is, because we move around on that depending on what's happening in our current lives. I have a really secure attachment style with my daughter. We have a really good setup that way. because it's a trusting, healthy,
Yeah.
we've got
Loving
strategy.
relationship.
It's there, it's healthy, right?
Yeah.
But when it comes to, say, a partner or one of my siblings or my parents, well, no, that's disrupted because there's history there. and if we haven't done the work to fix that attachment, guess what? It's not going to change. So that's the key thing to remember, because here's the thing. When you're somebody who's living in shame and guilt, well, your attachment is disorganized for sure. And that is going to play a role in your cognition and being able to reframe what you're trying to do to calm yourself down. Right? So somebody who is dealing with that shame and guilt, they're going to stay in that loop until they sit with someone like, say, a therapist who has no bias to the situation, who can just say, well, that's not a good way to talk to yourself. And how about we put me in your head? So, I'll introduce you to a little friend of mine that I have here. Because we're talking about the mind. Okay? So if there's any Star Wars fans out there, then hello from Mr. Vader. So this is my buddy that I bring in very early into my sessions with people. And I want to share this because I think this is a very important piece to that shame and that guilt. Because shame and guilt is gifted to us. Okay, I want to say that again. Shame and guilt is gifted to us. Okay, these are things that develop in our brain because maybe we've upset someone, or we've disappointed someone, or maybe we grew up in a household where parents just had really unhealthy expectations of us, and that's where it came from. Whatever it is, there's a root to that part of our brain. So I always like to introduce Vader. I do this by explaining it in this way. When we are born, we're born with a complete child mind, right? We're like that sponge that everybody always talks about, before 5 years old, let's get all the information in there. Let's teach all the skills, because that's when they're soaking everything up. And then after that, it's a slow decline down because we stop retaining information as well as we would have. Okay, but that's also some of our earliest experiences where we're nonverbal and can't speak our needs and can't ask for things without someone truly understanding us. So as we're going through our experiences, that part of our brain, the executive functioning part of the brain, we call it the adult part of the brain, it starts to grow because we have adults who are saying, when you're asking for water, the adult says, water. Then you go, water. Yes, good job, water, right? So you're having these experiences that are helping that part of the brain grow. Right. So then what starts to happen is, if we go through normal development, that small part of our brain, the child part of our brain, starts to shrink, and it's more adult part of the brain. Enter this guy. If we have any type of negative experience, then there's another part of that brain that starts to grow. And it's this guy. I call it the Vader brain. So every negative experience that we have, whether it's a critical parent, whether it's, alcohol in the family, whether it's trauma, whether it's bullying, like whatever it is that falls in that negative category of an adverse experience. So this could be like your parents getting divorced when you're 6. This could be, mom, something happening that breaks, maybe you lose a sibling, maybe there's someone that dies in your family that you're really close to, whatever it is, this guy starts to grow. And what happens is that he takes over the executive functioning. He does not bother the child brain. So then what you end up having, depending on how many of those experiences that you have, is you have all Vader and all child brain and no executive functioning brain. So what does that lead to? Impulsivity, tantrums. It leads to you navigating the world with all those negative voices, all those negative experiences in your head, paired with the child who doesn't have the skills. And that leads to dysfunction in relationships. It leads to awful feelings about yourself. Your self-esteem cannot develop. And then you also don't know how to, you find other ways of coping, like becoming a people pleaser, or all of these things that we do to try to keep ourselves safe from the people who put the Vader in our head, right? So then what happens is that fast forward when you get to me, let's say when you're in your 20s or your 30s, and you realize that life is not working for me, and I am drinking a lot, I'm doing drugs to cope because I'm trying to quiet this guy because he's awful.
Well, I was just going to say that's where in my experience, I have noticed that a lot of people who have had some severe trauma, like say the trauma happened when they were 12, their mentality stays at that 12-year-old, like,
yeah. This
and
guy,
I've seen
because he stunts the growth. He stunts the growth, right?
Yeah.
So what you do when you come to therapy is we channel the Yoda, right? Yeah. We bring in the Yoda. We repair the Vader. We fight him. We saber him, right? So what we have to do is we have to then start realizing that all those experiences, so like if you had a critical parent that constantly shamed you for just being you, then you're going to live with shame all the time. And every time you go to do something that you just intuitively want to do, you're hearing that voice in your head. So what we have to do is we have to learn skills to tame it.
Yeah.
Then this guy goes away, right? And then he takes a hike, and you start navigating the world now with your Yoda, which is kind of your executive functioning rebuilt.
Yeah.
And you, who you're meant to be. So that's a rough road, though. It's not easy because you have to unpack what's in that Vader mind, and you have to hold those people accountable. And guess what? People who harm you will never be held accountable. It just doesn't happen in this world.
I've been unpacking every day for the last 6 years, and I still say, holy fuck, when is this going to end? Like,
exactly.
The more I unpack, the deeper it goes.
Well, this is it. And so I will tell you, this is a part of the therapy that people don't like to hear, which is that trauma is a lifelong brain injury. It's not something that just goes away. Even when you're in active recovery and sobriety, you are still having to work on this all the time.
Yeah,
it never goes away. Your pain from those experiences never goes away. The key is for us to just tame it. We want to be friends, right? Like,
terrible.
So this guy's gonna hang with me. He's gonna be my buddy, but he knows his place, right? He knows he doesn't get to rule the roost like he was. He now understands that I'm the boss.
Mm-hmm.
So if you start coming up at an inappropriate time, no, but I'm going to listen to you later because there's a reason you came up, right? So like
figuring out those triggers and how to cope with them.
Right. Well, because here's the thing. So your brother lived with shame. Okay. Well, let's unpack that a second. He lived with shame because he didn't have a safe place to express it. He didn't have a safe place to let those authentic, deep feelings out. So he had to just literally have them be like a nag on his back.
Well, he did it with me, but I had put in some boundaries for myself. So he felt like I turned my back on him because I remember him, one of the last things he said to me about 2 months before he died was, sis, please don't turn your back on me again. And even though I didn't turn my back on him, I was setting healthy boundaries for myself and my child.
Yeah.
That's what it felt like to him.
Yeah.
So I couldn't even shit all over it. Like,
no,
I just said to him, like, it wasn't about you. It was about me. I needed to do that for me.
Yeah.
Because it was killing me to watch you go through that.
But that's the part of the attachment, right? It's part of the illness. Yeah. I don't even like to call it that, but it's part of the struggle. Let's call it that instead.
It's
part of the struggle, right? Because when you're in active use, you're like I said, it's Vader. Vader is, let's think about that character. Let's describe that character. He is narcissistic. He wants what he wants. He's going to do whatever he can to get what he wants. And he doesn't care who he hurts. But you know what? If any of my listeners know the story and have followed it all the way to the most recent Star Wars movie that they released, which I couldn't tell you the name of it, but in that movie, in that final movie, we learned that Vader actually was a good person at some point. He was one of the Jedis. He was good, but he had some bad things happen to him, and he let the darkness take over. He decided to live in it. And that is the difference between narcissism and empathic people. Absolutely. Right? We both have the same traumas. One of us decides we're going to spew that, project it out and hurt people to feel better. The other one of us burns ourselves out trying to save people from doing that to themselves.
True.
So in my opinion, I feel like someone who's living with addiction has both of those inside them.
Yeah.
And they are trying really hard.
They're at war within themselves, for sure.
They are, because they don't want anybody to feel pain. So when they're actively working on recovery and they're in they're in that maintenance phase of recovery, they are that empath and they're trying to do all the work to make everybody else feel good, but they're burning themselves out. So then that leads to using, possibly because they're burnt out and they have to cope. Or when they're actively using, they are in that narcissistic energy, possibly, and then they're shaming themselves for all the things they did to steal from their parents, or I hated on my sister, or we fought, or whatever the thing is, right? So they have this like constant battle, and it is such a, what's the wording I want to use, it's such a insidious thing, right? Because you can't just, it's not something you can just like go to therapy for a few days.
I call it the internal battle of good and evil, because that's exactly what it is. Like you're essentially fighting yourself. Yeah.
Well, and I'll tell you, this person that we lost when I was young, that one of those earliest traumas I had, he was in recovery when he died. So he had been to rehab. He had gone through programs. He had fought so hard to get to a place of living in sobriety. He started like, he kind of like dove into religion and God, and that was his way of coming out of it. And like, our whole family was just so proud of him. And then he died tragically, like in a regular, like, so like it was so opposite of anything that we thought would take him out. And so that was the unbelievable part. And I'll tell you, like, because I spoke a little earlier about the metaphysical stuff. I am very much in tune, and he is one of my guides. I know this. I know I was put on this earth to do this work, to change these structures, because he was failed by those structures in some ways. And he knows that. And he has come through whenever I've had, like a spiritual practice, or when someone has been doing, something with me, he's come through with the messaging that I'm here to right the wrongs and to help, get these messages out, to help people realize that, there is hope. There is life in recovery and sobriety, and you just have to find the right recipe for you. And everyone's recipe is different. You need to find the right therapist, you need to find the right programs, you need to find the right support system, you need to find the right funding, because that's another issue all in itself. So
the resources alone it's a fucking mess.
And then there's the whole other piece of that person has to be wanting to do the work.
Absolutely.
And that's the hardest part for the family members, right? To be
because you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink.
And then, and so who knows what his journey would have been like? Who knows if he would have, stayed sober for the rest of his life? We don't know, right? He didn't get a chance to live that out. But,
True.
The reality is that I learned enough from just watching his journey about what needs to be done differently.
Yeah.
And as you are with your experiences and now sharing. So I was very excited to be able to talk with you guys about this because, I don't, as a therapist, I actually do not classify myself as an addiction therapist. I actually am a trauma therapist, and that is what I am. But it all comes up,
Absolutely, it does.
Like 90% of my clients have struggles with cannabis,
some sort of addiction,
or some sort of, stimulant. And so, we work through it. And it takes time. It takes time of being, and it's so funny because this is also where I have a little bit of a war inside myself as a therapist because, we have all these ethics and rules we have to follow and guidelines about our immediacy and our openness with our clients. But like trauma therapists or trauma therapy is kind of like a really enmeshed thing.
Yeah.
Like sometimes in the beginning, so my standard view is 2 years to work with a client. That's my standard kind of over the last 5 years. That's what I've seen as like kind of the normal kind of timeline. In the beginning, they're like my little Klingon, right? Like they need me so much. Oh my God. And they guilt themselves for being so needy. And it's like, no, it's good. Like, let's just, like, you're not going to need this forever. And then, you fast forward to like 2 years down the road where it's like, it's a monthly check-in, but we get a lot of flack as therapists too, for being too involved. But sometimes you have to be like to truly understand, because here's the other thing that you probably know. Most people who are living with addiction or have had some severe traumas have such a thick wall up.
Yeah.
And they don't trust a soul.
So that is exactly why I went into coaching and instead of actual therapy, because I want to be on the ground. I want to be able to build that really, really raw, connection. And when you're governed by a body, like even as a PSW, I had to keep my distance, right? Like you have to keep your professional distance. And I get it. But the kind of work that I'm trying to do, you have to get on their level. Mm-hmm. They have to learn to trust you. And unless you're being completely open and vulnerable with them, they're not going to let down those walls. No, they're not. Especially these unhoused individuals.
Well, this is it.
Because they were programmed not to trust.
Yeah. Well, and how can they? They live on the street.
The system has failed them time and time and time and time again. So
and that's hard. It's hard because this is the ongoing debate in the medical field and in the psychology field, that there is this whole, well, it's the medical field's problem. No, it's the client's problem. Okay, well, how about we try to meet in the middle and realize that, each of us are not understanding how to navigate this fully, and that each individual is a whole different thing. Like we only know concepts based on research. And I'll tell you that the stuff that I know about the neurodiverse research is blown out the window in the last 5 years, because they only realized that they were doing research for ADHD on boys and men. They didn't even look at women. And now all of a sudden we've got 30 to 40-year-old women who are massively getting diagnosed because I'm
in the process of being diagnosed for ADHD right now.
Exactly.
And my whole entire life I just thought it was anxiety and depression.
or that there was something wrong with you, or
I
you're
was
crazy,
stressed.
or
Yeah.
you're hysterical, or
Yeah.
you're sensitive, or whatever, right?
Yeah. You're
And I'm
just
saying
too
it like
sensitive.
that.
You're
I'm saying,
lazy. You're scatterbrained.
yeah. So
Yeah.
I'm saying it like that because those are damaging statements.
Yeah,
And that's why
they
I'm
are.
mocking them, because I have spent my life hearing that bullshit on my report cards from my parents, from even just people in the community, because I'm a little too loud or I'm a little too excited. You know, I have had even friends who are like, no, if you have to do that to me, then we are not friends, because
right.
Me. And I and
why do you have to be so loud? Because I fucking am.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly. And I know how to pare it down when I'm in the right setting, but like, why should I have to do that with someone who's supposed to love and accept me for who I am? So,
but then when you are too quiet, or you are having a moment where you're zoning out, because we go through that as well, then it's like, what's wrong with you? Why are you so quiet? Nothing. Well, what do you mean nothing? What's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? And it's like, what the fuck?
But you can tell,
right?
like,
because you're overstimulated.
Well, this is it. So if you apply a lot of what we're just talking about to the Vader analogy, you can see why the internal, climate is so messed up, and how it can be a huge contributor to self-soothing with drugs and alcohol. Yeah. It's not just drug. I mean, and we talk about addiction, but it is sex. It is shopping. It is
gambling.
Yeah, like there is
food,
everything. Wide range of things. We can even be addicted to working out. We can be addicted to gaming. Cell phones, like
workaholics. I used to be a workaholic.
To
avoid everything in life, I would go to work.
Exactly. So I think that, one of the things that I do enjoy about what came out of the pandemic was that a lot of people really had an opportunity to see what trauma can do to someone. Yep. Because it happened on like such a global scale, when we were getting the reports about how much people were drinking and shopping, like Amazon, their stocks went through the roof because people were just buying all sorts of stuff because they were at home bored, right?
Feel good for that dopamine hit. Yeah.
So anyway, so I digress, but we get the picture. There's an internal thing going on. That mindset is a big part of what keeps us in that cycle, and trying to find a resource that fully understands that and can really help you work through that is a really good first step, right? And then it's trying to work on the window of tolerance around cravings and around response trigger, or like trauma responses and things like that, right? Because there's a whole boatload of that stuff too. Like, that's why I was telling you we could probably do like 3 or 4 podcasts on different topics.
Well, I told you we're down, right? We're down. And the defense mechanisms. My big thing right now is I'm trying to unlearn the defense mechanisms that I put into place as a child, and relearned healthier coping mechanisms.
Well, here's what I want to say something about that too, that I think is very important for listeners to understand about defense mechanisms. If you're still engaging in the unhealthy defense mechanism as an adult, don't shit on yourself about that.
No.
It was there for a reason.
It protected me for a very long time. Yeah, exactly. I honor it. And I'm so thankful for it. But now it's time for it to
like I think about people pleasing. People pleasing is something that we talk a lot about. It's kind of a very like trending term